somewhat a more somber, aspect of the pandemic is that we do know that there has been quite a lot of loss experienced over this time. We've all had that experience or know people who have not been able to attend funerals of, family members or loved ones. The loss of routine, just the simple, what we have been taken for granted to be able to do every day, our usual social engagements and so on. Jacqueline, I imagine that grief and loss are significant themes for carers as well, and particularly as with everybody during this time. I'd be interested to hear first about the work of the Carer-Counselling team at Maricara Services, and then perhaps if you could talk to us about the effects, how you've seen the effects of the pandemic has had on the lives of older people and particularly older women.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, I'm very blessed really to work with a great team of counsellors, and we make up part of a larger range of programs on behalf of Maricara Services. Maricara Services in turn is one of a whole lot of service providers now nationwide that deliver services to carers on behalf of the new Carer Gateway. What the Carer Gateway is, a tiny bit similar to, say, My Aged Care, where there's just a single contact point where some of the nearly 3 million carers across Australia can ring one number and be linked in with all the local service providers who provide supports around caring. So some of those different supports might look like funding for respite or equipment or transport, introductions to other carers and carer events, and then things like health coaching and counselling. And our counselling now extended to bereavement counselling as well. So all of those things are available to all carers across Australia. Our carers are generally people living at home and looking after someone in the same household, although not necessarily so. It might be a neighbour, it might be a friend. I had a look at some stats yesterday, and in Victoria, since the Carer Gateway came into being in early April, about 75% of people who've contacted us have been women, and about 70% of those are over 50. So very much talking about a group of people, a lot of women over 50 are in that caring role.
I shouldn't be surprised by those figures, but I am, I have to say. Yeah, anyway, go on. It's just,
I'm also aware, so my responses today really come out of that cohort of people, but I also just want to acknowledge that there's an awful lot of women 50 and older, and also men who live alone and might have a somewhat different experience in loss and grief. I really start by saying I loved Marlene's comment about the diversity of people who are older. In my work, what I get to see is that we can't take for granted, we can't think in terms of people from 60 to 100 having similar experience. And from a developmental perspective, but also in terms of loss and grief, one of the things we have as older people, I'm just tipping into that point myself, but is you've had a lot of practice at loss and grief, and a lot of practice at a lot of things, being challenged, facing change, and you bring that to your experience or your response to your current experiences. And I think that is an area where we could ask the media to please get in touch with some older people to tell us about what has loss and grief been like in the past, and how's that impacted on now, and what wisdom can they bring to younger people who perhaps have really struggled this year. But in terms of your question to me, I personally have reacted with absolute horror to many of the stories captured by the media this year about people dying alone in hospital or in aged care, and then their families having to set up Zoom funerals. COVID has also meant that, many of the people left behind, many people whose lives was always going to be seriously impacted by the death of someone very special in their life, maybe a spouse, but someone who has a role in their everyday life. When these people have died this year, it's meant the ones left behind have had to face bereavement, often in isolation, and that's a test, particularly for older people, because that's the generation who are most likely to die. One thing I've noticed and experienced myself to a degree is that COVID seems to have instilled a sort of ongoing undercurrent of anxiety and fear for everyone who's vulnerable, or maybe family members who know of other people who are vulnerable. So I've mentioned loss and grief in the context of bereavement, but I also want to acknowledge that there are many types of loss which might cause us to feel grief. And the rate of those losses sort of speeds up with age. You know, we become, even aside from COVID, as we get older, we're losing a range of things, our physical and cognitive capacity, maybe it's social connections. We leave work and we leave that behind. But I think COVID has brought to the fore a new range of loss and grief. So things like hopes and dreams. So many people had travel plans that they had to put aside. Friends of mine have bought a property that they've never been to, or they've been to in the last week or two. I think just losing a sense of peace, of being able to rely on our pre-COVID routines and our supports and our way of being in the world has really been a sort of rupture for a lot of people. And then there is the increase to caring roles, which has meant a lot of changes and a lot of loss of time, independence. So for instance, at Maricara Services, we've seen a lot of children who, when I say children, they might be in their 50s and 60s, who've moved back in with elderly parents to care for them. Many families have brought mum or dad out of aged care and back home. And then many families have decided to provide high care for their elderly relatives and relinquish the professional carers that might have been coming into the home before COVID to minimise everyone's exposure to COVID. Financial insecurity has been another thing that many older women have had to face, as well as the rest of society this year with the economic downturn. I think some of the people I talk to, there's not so much a sense of grief, but sometimes it's more an innate sense that things aren't right. And when you unpack that, you know, there might be sadness, longing, regret, increased anxiety, and all of those things. We sometimes find that, you know, people, once it's unpacked, that people are becoming more aware that it is grief and it is a sense of loss that they're experiencing.
I think, Jacqueline, I'm interested to, you know, to sort of explore a bit more. You know, you've sort of very clearly outlined what that, you know, the last few months, the impact that's had on people. But I'd really like to go back to that point that you made earlier about, you know, that older people have that wisdom that's gained through experience and often previous adversity. And I certainly know, you know, in my work at the very beginning of the pandemic, when, you know, talking with older people, and a lot of the reaction was, you know, this is okay. We've been through you know, similar or worse. We know what it's like to be, you know, restricted in our movements or being told what to do, you know, from our previous experiences. That might be through, you know, living in a country that was going through sort of political turmoil, civil unrest, or, you know, war, or all of those sorts of things. And we've got this sort of tool bag. We know how to do this. So I'm interested to hear about, and this will take us really nicely to talking with Caroline and the work she's doing about how what you've seen around that, you know, people's tool bags, what they've used, what's been the highlights for you around seeing how people have coped with, you know, these extraordinary times, and the you know, the more poignant, I guess, or difficult sort of grief and loss experiences.
I think, again, you know, I need to focus or bring back our focus that everyone's different.
Yeah.
Some people will cope better than others. Some people will be wiser than others. But at the same time, I think we can generalise and say that, you know, talking to people who are in an older age bracket, people who have faced a lot of challenges, people who have faced a lot of change, and anyone who was born sometime in the last century has faced almost continuous change. There's maybe a sense of acceptance that change and the unexpected is to be expected. Opportunities for continual reflection, reminiscence, connection with other people who also understand that, you know, with your own sort of peers, can be incredibly helpful. I think also having enough support, knowing that if it gets beyond you, there are places to turn, and that our society is going to look after us. And Ilsa made that point about people wanting to be seen. That's absolutely crucial to anyone's well-being, but we see it even more with older people, because it might be that when someone's telling me their story, they haven't even told that story for 30 or 40 years. There just hasn't been anyone in the meantime that has taken the time or had the opportunity to sit with them and listen to their story and their wisdom. And I, as I said a bit earlier, I think it would be great to see, to be captured in the media, for instance, some older, wiser people who could tell us about, well, we've lived through all these changes and this is what we found, and, you know, have their input into what we might hope for at different ages.